I'm Cynthia Greer, and in 2002, I was diagnosed with stage 3 cancer of the head and neck. At that time, I had become a full-time caregiver for my mother, and I was very concerned that I was not going to be able to finish taking care of her before she passed on. My mother and I both were in a very vulnerable position. The doctors were very honest with me. They told me that I could go through with the surgery, but I may not make it through. There was a chance that my heart would not be able to take it. My mother and I began to pray in the weeks that led up to the surgery. And on some level, I felt that I was going to somehow miraculously make it through. On the morning of the surgery, I met with the hospital chaplain, and I asked him to read the 51st Psalm just in case I did not make it. And that is the extreme unction that is usually done as the last rite for prisoners, as well as others that are beginning to cross over. And the chaplain looked at me and he said, I will do this for you, but I really believe that you are going to come through this. So as they were taking me to the OR, he was following and he was reading the scripture, and I was preparing to completely release any fear, any worry I had, and just go with it, because at that point I had no choice but to surrender. The next thing that I remember was I was in a chapel. I was very familiar with this chapel. It is in England. It is in Glastonbury, and it is connected to my family ancestry. And I could see in the front of the chapel Jesus and his mother Mary, and both of them were levitating off of the ground. And my mother and the chaplain were at their feet and they were praying. And I was well aware during the experience that they were in the hospital chapel and they were both actually praying for me as the surgery was going on. And I felt the energy of their prayers, and I felt the reception from Jesus and Mary. I knew that they were indeed listening to those prayers and that there was going to be a miracle that was going to take place. This is what was going through my mind. And all of a sudden, I began to see pink roses, and they were manifesting out of thin air, and they were falling over Jesus and Mary and onto the chaplain and my mother. And the next thing I knew, I was looking at a clock on the wall. It's a hospital clock, and it was 10 o'clock in the morning. And my mother, the chaplain, and one of the surgeons was at my bedside. They were holding my hands and they were welcoming me back into the world. And I had been in a coma for 2.5 days. I spent 1 week in intensive care, unable to breathe on my own. I had a tracheotomy I had tubes everywhere, and I could not talk because I had incisions that were from my right ear to the center of my throat and on the inside of my mouth. Following my stay in intensive care, I was taken for recovery to the surgical ward. And I had been there several days, and I was very close to the nurse's station due to the fact that I was a serious case because I couldn't speak and because I was so incapacitated and dependent on the life support as well as the intravenous feedings and medications. And one evening, I began to lose the ability to breathe. My windpipe completely closed off, and I began to panic. I knew that there was something wrong, that tracheotomy was blocked. And I was trying to reach my hand to the nurse's station so I could call the nurse. And I was trying to press that button. And I don't remember if I ever made it or not, because I immediately found myself moving upward. And it was as though I was swimming in a very thick mass that was similar to jello. Now, as I was moving upwards, I could see many spirits. I could see angels. And I all of a sudden found myself standing in a cemetery. And the cemetery was definitely in Europe. And I could see two men and a young woman standing beside a very ornate, large tombstone. And the men were dressed in full Scottish regalia, which is part of my family history. And I asked them, I said, has it happened? Have I gone to the other side? Have I died? Because I was very much aware that I was in between the worlds. And everything was telepathic, and they mentally communicated with me that no, I had not crossed over. I was going back because there was much I needed to finish. And I definitely was being given an extension of life in order to do it. I was curious about the young woman, and they said she would remain. She was on the other side. With that thought, I immediately found myself back in the physical body. There were nurses and several doctors all around me. I had a very close call. When I came more coherent, I was given the news that one of my cousins had passed on in a car accident several days earlier. And that cousin fit the exact description of the young woman in the cemetery. And I remembered she was indeed my cousin. I had a lot of time to think, and I experienced a lot in the weeks that followed my recovery as I began to prepare for the cancer treatments. And I realized that death is extremely serious. It is a lot more serious than people really understand, because the state that we die in makes all the difference. This lifetime that we have is a drop in the bucket compared to the millenniums and light years that we as souls live on this earth plane. And what we do, how we treat others, how we actually live our lives is the most important thing that we must remember. Because when we exit this physical body, We are going to be faced with our actions, with our behavior patterns, with every choice that we have made. And this is why it was so important for me to see my mother through to the very end, because she was severely disabled, and there was a chance, if she were placed in the wrong hands, that her final days, her final years would have been very difficult and possibly lived in great abuse. I became so much more aware of the state that this planet is in and the abusive nature towards those who are sick, disabled, elderly, and that changes need to be made because we are heading in the wrong direction. The cruelty and the judgment, the greed, the abuse that is done to one another is not in God's divine plan. And this is something that there still is time to change, but it is going to take great understanding, compassion, and opening at the level of the heart, because this is what is going to truly heal this planet. We all